You buy an old American farm on a quiet road where the fields look endless until you notice the one thing that shouldn't be there. Right in the middle of an otherwise perfectly usable stretch of land stands a giant oak tree. Not a young oak, not a pretty shade tree. This is enormous. Wide trunk, thick branches, leaves that seem to belong to a different climate. The canopy spreads like a roof over the whole property, and the roots are visible in the way the ground rises and dips around it. There's no neat row pattern here, no clean equipment path, just this stubborn, living obstacle in the center of the field. You walk closer. The soil around the base is darker, packed in some places, loose in others, like the ground has been worked by time rather than machinery. And you can practically picture what the season does around it. Extra turning, extra careful planting, extra detours when you're trying to move through your own land. You glance at the farmer who's been showing you around. Believable Rameau. You point at the oak. Why don't you just cut it down, you ask. I mean, look at this. It's taking up farmland. Farmer Brain smiles, not offended, almost amused, like you've asked a question that everyone asks at the beginning. That tree feeds this farm, he says. You blink, because it sounds ridiculous. Trees don't feed cattle. They don't fill the barn with hay. They don't directly grow corn or beans. They don't pour feed into troughs or haul grain into storage. This oak just stands there, getting in the way. You feel your brain try to argue with the sentence. So what could an old oak possibly do that makes sacrificing clear, usable land worth it? They learned by watching patterns, by remembering what worked, by noticing what changed when a tree was healthy, when it was gone, when storms hit, when heat stuck around too long. And in this field, the oak had been working for longer than any single person living could measure. Farmer Brain doesn't rush. He just gestures toward the oak, then toward the fields, the fence line, the spot where the wind seems to pick up. Come on, he says, like he's about to show you something you already know, but you haven't learned to notice yet. And that's the first lesson, maybe the biggest one, that old farming teaches. Surviving isn't only about force, it's about attention. Long before tractors, long before weather satellites and farm dashboards and all the modern tools that tell you what's happening out there, old American farmers learned that nature wasn't just scenery, it was infrastructure. It was the system that either supported you or punished you. You follow Farmer Brain to where the grass looks a little taller near the trunk, where the light is softer under the branches. This farm gets hot, you say, more like an observation than a question. Yeah, he replies, and his voice makes yeah sound like a forecast. Summer can be brutal. He starts talking about the kind of heat that doesn't just feel uncomfortable. It costs you energy. It costs your animals. It costs your workflow. You can picture it. The sun beating down for hours, the air turning heavy, cattle slowing their heads and searching for relief, horses moving slower because their bodies are working harder just to cope. Even chickens, those tough little creatures that usually act like they don't care, finding shadows and staying put, like they're taking shelter from a storm made of sunlight. Farmer Brain taps the ground lightly with his boot. Livestock with big shade trees stay calmer, he says. They rest more, they don't waste as much energy fighting the heat. He pauses, then adds, when they're less stressed, they do better. You don't have to spend as much time trying to keep things from falling apart. It's simple, but it lands. Shade isn't romantic, and it isn't measurable in the way a bag of feed is measurable, but it's still real. a single oak can become the most popular spot on the property, the place everybody ends up when the day starts to get mean. But shade wasn't the only job. You look toward the edge of the field. The grass there looks different, thinner, more wind-shaped. And in your mind, you can already see what would happen in a strong storm. Wind pushing hard across open ground, dust rolling in waves, young plants getting knocked around like they're little flags trying to survive. Farmer Brain follows your gaze. Storms are the next problem, he says. He describes it like something he remembers down to the sound. How wind doesn't just move air, it moves damage. How it can flatten crops before you even get a real harvest. How dust can drift across open fields and choke out seedlings, or cover leaves at the wrong time. Then he points at the oak again. Large trees act like windbreaks, Farmer Brain says. They slow the wind before it reaches the plants. You try to imagine it. The oak's branches taking the force, splitting the airflow, turning one hard blast into something weaker and more spread out. That difference matters. It's the difference between the storm stole our season and we got through it. And if a farmer is lucky, getting through it is the whole goal. But even if wind isn't devastating in one year, there's another danger that creeps in quietly. Soil. Farmer Brain crouches near the oak's roots. He runs his hand over the soil like he's checking a pulse. Heavy rain can wash topsoil away, he says, like he's describing an everyday habit of weather. On open ground, water hits hard and runs off. It takes the good stuff with it. He lifts his hand and shows how the soil around the roots seems different, held together, a little more anchored. Tree roots help the soil stay stronger, he continues. They hold the earth in place. Water has somewhere to soak in instead of just rushing away. It's not a fancy explanation. It's what you'd learn if you paid attention. Where the roots are healthy, the land keeps more of itself after a storm. And then, little by little, the oak starts to make sense in a bigger way. You're not just seeing a tree in a field. You're seeing a system, a living network that quietly changes how heat behaves, how wind behaves, and how water behaves. But Farmer Brain says there's another part people forget, the part that doesn't look helpful until you count the pests you don't have. Birds, he says. You glance upward. The branches above you are busy with leaf shadows, and you can already hear tiny movements, small wings, small voices. It's the kind of activity you'd notice if you weren't busy trying to evaluate the farm like a spreadsheet. Big trees are home to birds, Farmer Brain says, and those birds don't just sit around being pretty. He explains it like old wisdom. Many birds eat insects that chew up crops or bother animals. When there's wildlife around, it can help keep pest numbers from exploding. He makes it sound straightforward, like an agreement between neighbors rather than a scientific process. Farmers might not have named the mechanism, but they notice the results. Healthier farms with trees often meant fewer problems to fight. It's a tough thing to admit, because it doesn't feel as direct as harvesting. It feels indirect, like luck. But over generations, patterns stop being luck and start being truth. And some trees don't just protect you, they also feed you, at least indirectly. Farmer Brain shifts his weight and points toward the idea of harvest, but he doesn't mean corn. Some oaks bring food for wildlife, he says. Walnuts, chestnuts from nearby types, apples and persimmons and mulberries, those trees can show up across a farm. The fruit and nuts feed animals that would otherwise wander into places they shouldn't. You can almost see it, the wild creatures staying occupied in the woods and under the branches, giving the garden a little peace. The tree becomes a buffer, a quiet attraction. Again, not magic, just balance. So the oak in the middle of the field isn't only making room for shade. It's helping the soil stay put. It's softening wind and storm damage. It's bringing birds and other wildlife. It can even reduce losses by offering something else for animals to eat. When you add it up, the sentence, "that tree feeds this farm," stops sounding silly. It's just feeding in ways you don't always measure with a ruler. Then Farmer Brain walks you toward a patch of ground where the shade is thick and cool. The air under the branches feels different, less like a furnace, more like a pause button. That's the part people underestimate, he says. A tree like this doesn't only help the livestock, it helps the humans. You nod, because even you can feel it. Your shoulders relax under the oak. You're not thinking about work. You're thinking about comfort. Farmer Brain talks about what farms used to be like before everything became screens and schedules. He describes children playing beneath trees, wagons stopping there to rest, workers taking breaks in the afternoon heat, meals shared under branches. In a lot of places, he says, the biggest tree became the heart of family life. You imagine a farm where the oak is the landmark, where people naturally meet, where stories happen, where time slows down for a moment, even when the chores don't. And for Farmer Brain, there's another reason the oak isn't just in the way. Age. He looks at the tree the way you'd look at something that survived you. Some farms had trees standing for 100 years, he says. A grandfather planted it, his son took care of it, the grandchildren climbed it. In that moment, cutting the oak down doesn't sound like an equipment choice. It sounds like breaking a link. Cutting it down isn't just removing a tree, Farmer Brain continues. It's removing part of a family's history. He straightens and looks back out at the field. Old American farmers didn't treat old like a problem. They treated it like proof. A healthy tree had survived storms, drought, lightning, floods, winters that made everything feel slower, heavier, harder to live through. If a tree could handle all that, if it could stand there year after year, then maybe it was doing something right. Maybe it deserved its place. And over time, that respect becomes tradition. Farmer Brain doesn't need to argue that every story is scientific. He just says what he heard, what people believed, what farmers repeated, because it helped them pay attention. Some folks thought certain trees protected the farm, he says. Some believed removing an old oak brought bad luck. You can hear the uncertainty under the stories, the way beliefs sometimes form when people want meaning in the middle of uncertainty. Whether the stories were true didn't really matter, he adds. The trees stayed standing. And staying standing meant the benefits kept stacking up. Shade when summers got brutal, windbreak when storms bullied the crops, roots when rain tried to wash the farm away. The interesting part is that modern science eventually caught up to what old farmers already knew through experience. You ask him if the tree is just tradition, and Farmer Brain gives you an answer that feels like it comes from both memory and observation. Modern research shows a lot of what we noticed was right, he says. Shade reduces heat stress in livestock. Trees help prevent erosion. The roots improve soil structure. They support birds and beneficial wildlife. Windbreaks reduce damage to crops. You try to picture a lab proving what farmers felt in their bones. But even if someone could measure it with instruments, the original knowledge came from paying attention the hard way, through seasons, through repeated outcomes. And now, Farmer Brain says, more farms are bringing trees back on purpose. People are planting trees around fields and pastures, he says. Some call it conservation, some call it sustainable agriculture. He shrugs, like names don't matter as much as results. Old American farmers would probably just call it common sense. You glance again at the oak in the middle of the field. It's so obvious now, how it changes the space around it, how it isn't an accident, how it isn't negligence. It's a choice made long ago, and a lesson continued through time. So you stop thinking like a person judging from the outside. You start thinking like someone responsible for a living system. Because if you cut it down, what happens? You don't just remove shade. You lose a windbreak when storms push hard. You lose root structure when heavy rain hits. You lose habitat when birds and wildlife need a place to exist. You lose a quiet food source that helps animals stay away from sensitive areas. And you lose the place where people naturally gather to rest, to eat, to talk, to breathe for a minute between chores. That's why Farmer Brain didn't say, "That tree is nice." He said, "That tree feeds this farm," not only by producing anything you can bag, but by keeping the farm functioning, reducing stress, reducing damage, holding the land together, and turning nature into an ally instead of an enemy. As you walk back toward the farmhouse, you notice how the field looks different now that you've learned to see it. The oak isn't blocking your view, it's organizing the landscape. It's acting like a shield and a shelter. It's cooling animals. It's protecting the soil. It's sheltering birds. It's stopping the wind. It's feeding wildlife. And quietly, it gives tired farmers a place to rest after a long day of work. Not in a dramatic way, in the way that matters most, daily relief. Before you reach the barn, you ask one last question, because your mind keeps trying to turn the story into a rule you can carry. So what should I do, you ask? If I want my farm to be healthy, like you're saying, what does that look like? Farmer Brain watches you for a second, like he's deciding how direct to be. Then he answers simply. Pay attention to what nature is already doing for you, he says, and don't treat every old thing as a waste of space. He gestures back toward the oak one more time. The next time you drive through the American countryside and you see one giant tree standing alone in a field, he says, take a closer look. He lets the sentence hang there for you to imagine. It might not be a mistake at all. It might be one of the oldest and smartest farming traditions America ever had. You feel the final truth settle in. The oak isn't standing because the farmer was too lazy to cut it down. It isn't forgotten. It isn't ignored. It's maintained by respect, by the kind of experience that turns observations into survival. And standing there, it keeps doing what it's been doing for years, longer than your plans, longer than your schedule, longer than any single season. He turns back toward the house and speaks like he's talking to the future, not just to you. Somebody planted it, he says, or somebody learned from it. Either way, that old tree has been taking care of this farm longer than I have. Then you look at the oak one more time, and this time you don't see an obstacle. You see a living reason